Good afternoon, everybody. We're about to start the panel called Psychohistory at the Crossroads, Learning from the Past and Present. So this is the first of two panels. There'll be another panel on the future of psychohistory tomorrow at 1 o'clock or 1:30, whatever it is. And today we have a distinguished panel. And they're each going to speak for 15 minutes except one. And we have David Beisel, professor at SUNY Rockland, Peter Petschauer, who is now emeritus at Appalachian State University and is the author recently of In the Face of Evil, The Sustenance of Tradition. David Lotto, who is a psychoanalyst practicing in the metropolitan area of Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Paul Elovitz, who doesn't need an introduction, but we'll get one anyway. He is professor at Ramapo State College.
Ramapo College.
Ramapo College in New Jersey. He is the founder, editor of Psychohistory Forum and editor of Clio's Psyche. The Psychohistory Forum has been going on for over 30 years. And we have Molly Castelloe from Metropolitan College.
Yes.
Metropolitan College. She is also the founder and starter and keeps going the listserv for Clio's Psyche. So the past and present, and me. My name is Jose Jimenez. No. I'm Ken Fuchsman from the University of Connecticut. I will be the moderator and the timekeeper. So,
Shall we speak from here or
wherever you feel comfortable.
everyone here? I have prepared comments. Psychohistory and the historians. Psychological history, of course, refers to the scholarly work appearing in print and scholarly conferences from about 1970 on. The first reaction of historians to this new direction was enthusiastic acceptance. For those who took part in those heady days of the early 1970s, it looked like psychohistory's golden era was upon us. Since then, the relationship between history and psychohistory has gone through several phases. It was not long before critical attacks began, soon massive waves of them. At first, those early criticisms were respectful, collegial, often intellectually acute. Some were fun. A captionless cartoon appeared in the New Yorker showing a door labeled Psychohistory Ward. More impassioned arguments soon arrived, some heated, some angry, some cruel and demeaning. They came from anywhere, scholarly journals, even one's own university. "Hey, Psycho," yelled one of my colleagues every time we passed in the hall, until I put a stop to it. Wanting to be polite, most psychohistorians met these critical assaults with respectful replies. We were looking to be legitimized by the big daddies. William Langer's name was often invoked. A well-known Harvard University historian, Langer had said in his 1957 presidential address to the American Historical Association that an iron curtain separated psychology from history. He asked historians to integrate psychology and psychoanalysis in their work. References to Langer, though, did little to legitimize psychohistory, since most historians had long ago written Langer's address off as coming from someone who had already lost his mind. Things weren't always bad. An uneasy truce, a kind of grudging acceptance, existed between historians and psychological historians in the 80s and 90s. Meetings were held, journals published, books appeared, even the AHA allowed a panel or two at its conventions. On the other hand, still most members of the AHA agreed with Columbia University historian Michael Morris, leave motivation to the psychologists. They did so, never citing the findings of psychiatrists like Bessel van der Kolk, Gerald Post, or Vanek Volkan. On the other hand, psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton has had a long and distinguished career. He proudly proclaims himself a psychohistorian. Judging by the number of times his book, The Nazi Doctors, has appeared in the bibliographies of studies on Nazism, it seems historians regard him as the most respectable of all psychologically oriented scholars. Yet despite this reputation, a New York Times book reviewer can call his work psychobabble. The sad truth is that while The Nazi Doctors sometimes appears in historians' bibliographies, Lifton's findings almost never show up in their narratives. At the very moment when the most vocal critics were denouncing psychohistory, they were working a subtle sleight of hand behind the scenes, sneaking psychology into their work through the back door. Serene Kershaw is a good example. His 2-volume Hitler biography has been widely praised. It is superb history. It is also openly anti-psychological. Early on, Kershaw denounces psychohistory as too speculative. He introduces the word psychohistorians by breaking the offending thing at the hyphen, keeping it from contaminating his text by quarantining it in quotation marks. Then, while accepting that Hitler's father, Alois, was a distant and abusive father who beat his son, Kershaw discounts the extensive scientific literature on the consequences of child abuse. Quote, "What the legacy for all this was for the way Adolf's character developed," he said, "must remain a matter of speculation." No sooner does Kershaw inform the readers that he wouldn't be doing any psychology than he says of Hitler, quote, "It takes little to imagine that his later patronizing contempt for the submissiveness of women, the thirst for dominance, and imagery of the leader as stern authoritarian father figure, the inability to form deep personal relationships, his corresponding cold brutality toward humankind, and not least, the capacity for hatred, so profound that it must have reflected an immeasurable undercurrent of self-hatred concealed in the extreme narcissism that was its counterpart, must surely have had its roots in the subliminal influences of the young Adolf's family circumstances." Sounds like psychohistory to me. While historians were expropriating psychological thoughts without owning up to it, a new campaign was brewing in another quarter, the pretense that psychohistory didn't exist at all. Preeminent here was the New York Review of Books. The late Barbara Epstein, co-founder and co-editor of the New York Review, was a longtime friend of neurologist and psychohistorian Barry Coleman. At one of their periodic luncheon meetings, Epstein told Dr. Coleman, "Under no circumstances will any psychohistory ever be reviewed in the NYRB." A particularly egregious example was how the NYRB treated the late historian Peter Gay's multi-volume Bourgeois Experience, in which the review referred to Gay as a cultural historian, ignoring his having written a biography of Freud using Freud's own theories, training as a psychoanalyst, writing a book called Freud for Historians, and calling himself a psychoanalytically informed historian for much of his career. Not only did the review disbar psychohistory from its pages, it launched an active anti-psychological, anti-psychoanalytic campaign by periodically publishing the anti-psychological rants of Frederick Cruz. Cruz once denounced Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery as feminist propaganda. Whatever the individual causes behind Cruz rants, failed analysis perhaps, by publishing them and pretending psychohistory doesn't exist, the NYRB has done a disservice to both scholarship and the general public. None of this shows up in Martin Scorsese's documentary, The 50-Year Argument. During these years, the American Historical Review refused to review prominent historian Rudolph Binyon's books on the grounds they weren't history. Binyon was one of many, including myself, who dropped their membership. That left no one to advocate for psychohistory in the AHA. Just 5 months ago, the editor of the American Historical Review reminded the profession that, quote, "historians have long been allergic to psychological explanations." We know that, But while correct on the face of it, this is a misleading metaphor. Historians are not allergic at all. One can avoid peanuts and take medications to mitigate the effect of allergies. This is not the goal of historians. The current phase of history's relationship with psychohistory does not reflect reasoned intellectual discourse, though most historians would claim it does. It is tragic and irrational to denounce thousands of articles and books without having examined them. We have today 1 part elite snobism, 1 part revulsion to insight, and 1 part murderous rage. The self-appointed guardians of history's sacred precincts are after nothing less than psychohistory's complete annihilation. This has been so for quite a while now. A few years ago, historian and psychoanalyst Jacques Saluda buttonholed the editor of the American Historical Review at an AHA convention and asked him if the review would be publishing any psychohistory. The editor, backing away, mumbled something about, "We don't publish that stuff in the AHR." You might want to take comfort from the editors of the newly published Cambridge University Press volume, Psychology and History. In their conclusion, the editors take a cue from the chapter written by Paul Elovitz to argue that psychohistory has, quote, ended up marginalized by both mainstream psychology and mainstream history, but has survived in spite of this and thrived on the periphery of both disciplines. This is not the fantasy historians have concocted for themselves. To the American Historical Association, as for the AHR, psychological history is not marginalized. It no longer exists. The heresy has been cast aside, a dead end that didn't pan out. It is to be erased from memory, buried without ceremony, history's forgotten bastard child. Sounds extreme? Here are some facts. The AHA presents itself as a big tent, scholarly organization, proudly announcing it welcomes all kinds of historical scholarship. The AHA publishes a taxonomy of historical areas of interest, including more than 665 officially sanctioned specializations. One subfield is not recognized by the AHA, psychohistory. After spending many years on the official list, it was dropped from the AHA's taxonomy several years ago. I lobbied the AHA president for its restoration, citing thousands of books, flourishing journals, robust scholarly organizations, and large college class enrollments. She assured me psychohistory would be reinstated. 4 years later, it has not happened, and it is not likely to happen. 5 months ago, historian Lynn Hunt reiterated the AHA's party line. Hunt is the author of a psychologically oriented history of family romance of the French Revolution, the chief author of a widely used college textbook, past president of the AHA, and the distinguished research professor and Eugen Weber Professor of Modern European History Emerita at UCLA. Her words carry weight. In the December 2014 American Historical Review, Hunt declared, quote, "The demise of psychohistory, the Iron Curtain mentioned by Langer in his 1957 presidential address, remains standing. The few attempts to build up a subfield of psychohistory," she announces, "have collapsed under the weight of its own presuppositions." The culprit beneath these presuppositions was, of course, the, quote, false, close quote, ideas of psychoanalysis. The hidden message is clear. With Freud now safely dead and buried, historians can sleep soundly in the comfortable knowledge that psychohistory lies buried in the coffin with him. The thing is, we're still here. Who knows how long it will last? There is always the possibility of revival. Pendulums do swing back. Judith Herman reminds us trauma needs rediscovering every generation. My guess is that someone out there with a strong will for self-discovery and a desire to understand what moves beneath the surface will find ways to keep psychological history alive. I hope so. For now we have today, that should be enough.
We're going to hold the questions till the end, so.
I tend to be a little more optimistic. That's not hard. The advantages of applied psychohistory. I came to the field while teaching at Temple University in the late 60s, read everything I could about applied psychoanalysis and psychohistory, as it was then beginning to be called more often, and expected that we had excellent prospects. However, the world isn't knocking at the doors of psychohistorians, interviewing us for our methodologies and wisdom. Rather, we are akin to the situation of psychotherapists who are available and called upon to help with life's problems that bring people to their doors. The psychohistorians, like psychotherapists, can have the greatest impact by helping people and groups and individuals with their difficulties. Of course, we don't hang out our shingle and help to write the diagnostic and statistical manuals promoting insurance companies to pay for even short-term therapy treatment. Rather, we are in a much more hit or miss situation. Below are some examples of applied psychohistory and the colleagues who have made it happen. I start with General Wild Bill Donovan of the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the CIA during World War II, who tapped the psychiatrist brother of the Langer that David mentioned, the prominent historian at Harvard, said, do a study of Hitler so that we can know better what he'll do. It actually wasn't a bad study, especially given the counter-transference of wartime, and it correctly predicted that Hitler would commit suicide. Walter Langer was so taken by the process, he said, well, let me do the same for Joseph Stalin, the man of steel. Oh, no, he's our ally. This is only for enemies. But, of course, the CIA has a whole big staff down in Langley, Virginia, who are writing biographies and psychobiographies, which never get published, of leaders of the world and potential leaders of the world and movements. Knowing how leaders will behave is something very valuable. The lives of former presidents have been looked into, and then when we had a fellow named Richard Milhous Nixon as our president, it became very popular since he was so disliked by intellectuals to read psychological studies of him. One of the best was actually requested by a publisher. It was called Nixon versus Nixon. When David and I were giving in 1976 presentations on Jimmy Carter at the first National Psychohistorical Convention that was held in North America, the distinguished psychological scholar, excuse me, Robert J. Lifton walked up to me and proclaimed that you cannot give your presentation this afternoon since it would be unethical to write on a candidate without his written permission. Clearly, this presumption was that I would be psychopathologizing the future president. Now, Lifton was then a member of the American Psychiatric Association, and which had prohibited its members from doing psychobiographies because of the smear job some of them had done, a large number actually, on the 1964 candidate for president named Goldwater. I, being kind of a determined guy, I had been a little awed by Lifton to that point, and I remained enormously respectful. Went ahead and gave my presentation. I was writing a book on him, but I backed away from it when I found the major chapter I was writing was called Jimmy Carter as a Self-Defeatist, because I didn't know how to navigate between my own feelings as a American citizen and what I was finding. This strongly influenced my type of psychohistory, which is to focus not on psychopathology, but on childhood coping mechanisms, creativity, dreams, group fantasies and delusions, innovations, personality, and overcoming trauma. Clearly, this isn't the major approach within psychohistory. And so long as psychohistory is associated with psychopathology, our field will be marginalized, though not nearly as bad as the formal historical establishment has done, as David indicated. Though, by the way, all sorts of historians, when they get to particular problems, go ahead and do lots of psychohistory. They just don't call it such, as he also did indicate. The problem of psychopathologizing is very real. And some people get best-selling books like the psychiatrist, psychoanalyst Justin Frank, who wrote Bush on the Couch, and more recently Obama on the Couch, and neatly fitting these people into pathological categories. There are good guidelines for how to do what I've been doing since '76, writing up presidential candidates and presidents, that you can find in the Benchon's Psychological Assessment of Presidential Candidates, written in '96. Back to Robert J. Lifton. He's a strong advocate of applied psychohistory in his extraordinarily productive career that has covered so many different areas, though not presidential psychobiography per se. He runs the oldest continuous psychohistory group, which occurs every fall at his summer home in Wellfleet. He considers himself a psychohistorian, though he doesn't like to use the term psychohistory for his work, but he brings people together who are very smart, some very explicitly psychoanalysts and psychological in their approach, and helps people to develop their ideas to a greater extent. His best example of applied psychohistory was when he left his sterling professorship of psychiatry at Yale University to establish the Center on Violence and Human Survival at John Jay College of CUNY, with a major grant from New York State. And he'd have monthly seminars which he brought together a lot of colleagues and policymakers. I remember one with a Scandinavian working for the United Nations, who was an inspector of weapons, mass destruction in Iraq, who gave a very interesting presentation. This was before we decided that we should be invading Iraq because they had weapons of mass destruction, due to our confusion with mass delusion and mass destruction, or something similar. Regrettably, when Lifton's budget was cut, he retired from CUNY, took an honorary lectureship at Harvard University, and continues his Wellfleet meetings. Charles Strozier, who for 3 decades had been Lifton's protege, inherited the CUNY seminars. He decided to devote his time at the center, to transform that center to a center on terrorism, training policemen and firefighters who had suffered such grievous losses in 9/11. This is a good example of applied psychohistory, and he continues to send invitations to psychological colleagues, including me, to attend these meetings. He also did this in part because of the pressure for him to increase his teaching load, and this helped keeping the center going, but specific to firemen and policemen's education, helped lessen the teaching load. The Strozier was the editor and the key person in the Psychohistory Review, which is a fine publication, a little somewhat more intellectualized than the Journal of Psychohistory or Clio Psyche that I edit, but a good publication. But he subsequently grew tired of it. That's a quote of his words, and was upset that that there weren't the type of rewards that he thought would come in the historical community. So they closed down the publication in '99, which was quite regrettable. Another advocate of applied psychohistory is Van McVolken, who Molly will provide a lot of information on, whereas Lifton's military service took him to the Far East, prompting his study of Chinese communist thought control and the survivors of Hiroshima. Volken's birth on the island of Cyprus, divided between Greeks and Turks, led him to probe how people living next door to each other, growing up together, could maintain separate identities, which would promote them to hate and ultimately kill each other. When his home island became engrossed in the Civil War, he worried about the well-being of his family, from the safety of a psychiatric hospital at the University of Virginia, and suffered somewhat from survivor's guilt, and turned to the issue of how do you deal with that hatred? This resulted in a valuable book, The Need to Have Enemies and Allies from Clinical Practice to International Relations. And altogether he's written about 60 books in a half dozen different languages. He created a Center for Understanding of Mind and Human Interaction and presided over it for 14 years. Created a journal, which he edited for a while, Journal of Mind, Human Interaction. And for a while served as president of the International Society for Political Psychology, the ISPP. So he's been very devoted to how do you apply what we know to the situation of people who are involved in hatreds and in struggles. The people he's worked with have been Estonians and Russians, Georgians and South Ossetians, Palestinians and Israelis, and so forth. You can find accounts of what he did in his autobiography, Enemies on the Couch, a psychopolitical journey through war and peace. and in the Festschrift for Van Volken that we published in September 2013 with lots of help from Molly. Although I work to avoid psychoanalytic and psychohistorical terminology in my scholarship, I have to confess to being, despite my low-key approach, a psychohistorical imperialist. I'm imperialist in the sense that I want to extend the insights and methodologies of our field to as many different people and subjects as possible. This is one of the reasons why I've encouraged friends, colleagues, to apply their psychohistorical knowledge to both music and poetry, despite having resistance initially from some more conservative types, like David Beisel, who's been won over to do both of these things. He and Ken are a group I call the Jazzaholics. Poetry, music have incredible ability to reach our emotions and stir up such powerful feelings and thoughts. And people who do not see themselves as psychologically attuned can be drawn to the power of these ancient modalities and do a better job of understanding themselves when they bring psychology into the mix. Our goal should always be to expand this psychohistorical paradigm into as many areas as possible. I recommend the methodology that I've developed over 4.5 decades. That is to listen carefully to the interests and passions of others and to work in the spirit of midwife, in the birth of, help them with the birthing of their knowledge. This means to encourage and take their ideas very seriously and to develop them into articles, books, presentations, and sometimes into their life's work. Just as Freud's methodology of listening, observing the transference is vital to psychoanalysis, listening to the ambivalences, conflicts, and unresolved traumas of modern society can make us more useful to our world. When individuals and groups come to us with their problems, we should be ready to help, as have been Volken, Lifton, and other colleagues. Thank you. Okay, read 25 minutes last night.
Now, David Lotto, the editor of the journal.
Okay, well, I didn't realize that this is turning into a Lifton. Everybody has lots to say about it. I have lots to say about Lifton, too.
Can't hear you.
Okay, so let me just go up there. So about Lifton, I do have to talk about the Lifton story. It seems like you made a category error. If you were a member of the American Psychiatric Association, there might be a possible conflict of interest in what you're doing. But given that you're not, his comment is totally irrelevant to you. Of course, people are allowed to talk about whatever they want to talk about.
But that's not what he said. And he's a big, tall guy, and he leaned over me. I never met him.
Anyway, I think it's a category error. I mean, I understand where that comes from, and if you were a member of the American Psychiatric, you would have a problem. But you don't if you're not. Anyway, so one more suggestion. I think you should, when you introduce yourself as a presidential historian, I think you should also introduce yourself as a psychohistorian's psychohistorian. You had a lot to say about a lot of people in the field. Anyway, I just have a few things I wanted to say. I'd like to start with a brief story from the history of psychohistory. When Eric Erikson, Robert Lifton, Kenneth Caniston, Bruce Majlish, Philip Reeve started the Wellfleet Psychohistorical Group in 1966, the group that Paul's referred to. There was some intention to promote psychohistory as an independent academic discipline or subfield. That project was abandoned. In his recent memoir, which is Lifton, Witness to an Extreme Century, he says, quote, "The relatively academic ambience of our first few Wellfleet meetings reflected our initial illusion, which it did not take us long to give up, that of creating an academic discipline of psychohistory." That's what he says in the book. So I wrote to Lifton and asked him, quote, from my email, "I was wondering if you have anything to add about why creating an academic discipline was an illusion and what caused him to give it up." He replied, quote, "What I meant by that comment was that I consider psychohistory more an approach than an actual academic discipline." Quote. He also added, my main statement about this is in an essay called On Psychohistory, which is in various places. One of his books, History and Human Survival, it's a chapter in that. The title is Psychoanalysis and History. So he goes into a little more detail, but basically that's his stance. I'll say something more about this in a few minutes, but first I'd like to say something about what I consider to be psychohistory. I see the range and scope of psychohistory as quite broad, and its boundaries to be expansive. For me, the essence of what makes a study psychohistorical is that it seeks to understand or explain its subject matter in terms of psychological motivation. Although most of what has been considered to be psychohistory, even most of DeMoss's work, has come from a psychoanalytic, or at least a psychodynamic perspective, I would also consider work using other non-psychoanalytic psychological approaches, for example, terror management theory, to be psychohistorical work as well. I also consider, like Paul, the range of subject matter that can be investigated to be extensive. It would include any biography, study of past or current events, intellectual history, history of ideas, cultural anthropology, sociology, even philosophical inquiries, as long as they focus on psychological motivation. Also, studying group phenomena, including the investigation of ideologies, political and social movements of all sorts, cultural studies, women's studies, critical analysis could also be included. In addition, explorations of the entire world of artistic, literary, and musical creations, again to the extent they seek to understand things in terms of human motivations, would be included. What makes it psychohistorical is not the subject matter, but trying to use psychological motivations and processes, whether individual or group, as at least one crucial factor in coming to understand the phenomena under study. I would consider just about all of what is usually referred to as applied psychoanalysis to be psychohistory, or psychohistorical. In my view, psychohistory should be more of an adjective and less a noun. More of a way of thinking, a perspective that can be applied across many scholarly pursuits, as well as to many areas of actual real life. Or as Lifton puts it, more an approach than an academic discipline. For a study to be psychohistorical, it should address psychological motivation, but not necessarily exclude other explanatory factors when attempting to understand the why of not just history, but the why of about any aspect of human behavior, as well as any aspect of the world of human creations, including ideas as well as artifacts. I believe that there are significant advantages to taking this kind of a broad, inclusive, and tolerant stance toward what constitutes psychohistory. First, it eliminates the problem of finding the proper place in the universe of academic disciplines and sub-disciplines for psychohistory to fit into. Another advantage to defining psychohistory broadly is that it makes it easier to be accepting, or at least tolerant, toward a wide variety of ways to answer the why questions. Also, such a view can help minimize various divisive schisms and turf wars. There are many possible answers to questions of which and what sorts of motivations or motivational theories are most useful in understanding any particular subject we are examining. So we don't, for example, have to say that factors related to child rearing must be central to our account in order to label it as psychohistorical. Nor do we have to maintain that non-psychological factors, the many external forces that impinge on us from the outside, Brian's view, whether they are man-made social, cultural, political, or economic realities or not, are not important to understanding why things are the way they are. Perhaps in addition to or alongside of psychological factors. I am arguing for an inclusive approach, that psychohistorical studies should be under a big tent, to use Van McVolken's metaphor. Much of what I would consider to be psychohistorical work is done by individuals who do not identify themselves as psychohistorians. They might identify as psychoanalysts, psychologists, political scientists, historians of some other sort than psychohistory, which means all. It's not one of the 600, right? So that would be all historians. Anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, social critics, literary critics, public intellectuals, social activists, feminists, futurists, or any other such label of people could all be considered to be doing psychohistorical work at times. I do not see any reason to be disturbed by the fact that most of these people have no interest in identifying as psychohistorians or acknowledging that they are doing psychohistorical work, even though, in my view, when they are addressing the motivations for the actions and creations of the humans they are trying to understand, they're doing psychohistory. I think that one of the reasons Lifton and his colleagues gave up on the project to create a thing with a unique identity called psychohistory is that they realized that there were severe difficulties in trying to specify the boundaries of such a discipline or field. So much of what so many different scholars were doing could properly be called psychohistory. But the people who were doing it often strongly self-identified in other ways. For the most part, they had no interest in identifying with the new discipline or in labeling their work as psychohistorical. Okay, that's it.
I would just speak from here. Let me know if you can't hear me. Well, I'm still learning a lot about psychohistory, but these are the few of the ideas that I've been thinking about that are important. And some of my, the things that I want to do. I think the idea of a Child History Month is appealing to me. And it's curious that we only have recognize a month for child abuse, the Child Abuse Month. And I think it would be really interesting to think about childhood history based on the model in the United States of Women's History Month, which goes back to International Women's Day in 1911. In California, in 1978, there's a Women's History Week. So I think the idea of building recognition and meetings and conferences around childhood history would be an important step. I wanted to address one other main idea that I've been thinking about. I've been thinking a lot about research and methodology in psychoanalysis, the clinical psychoanalysis. And there's a problem presenting evidence because case studies in terms of methodology is the lower kind of evidence-based material for proving whether it's a science or discipline or collection of ideas. And I know that's a problem right now in psychoanalysis, and there's new efforts to operationalize psychoanalysis, and I know there's tremendous resistance against it. But the question of how to put things and experience and history into quantifiable terms. And I've just finished doing a class on this, and most people don't like the idea because it's run so counter to our intuition and our own experiences, which we don't usually express in those terms. One of the ways that I know that researchers are dealing with that is a before and an after, and talking to people, and I think interviewing and using different kinds of methods in the research. So interviewing people before and after experimental test. After a factor has been introduced into their experience, and speaking to them beforehand and getting answers to certain qualities of their life, certain measures of health, like relationships, like consistent job, consistent work. It's not just the lack of a symptom, but it's the presence of health in the way we like to describe it in certain terms. And so I think that would be something, I know it's hard to think about, but I think that was something that would help increase our presence in other disciplines. I want also I don't know how many of you know this, but Ken was recently interviewed to speak about John F. Kennedy in a film. And I don't know how many of you have heard about that, but I think that's another kind of experience that I wanted to ask you a few questions about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, do I have time now for that?
Yeah, you do.
Okay.
How can I say no to that?
What?
How can I say no to that?
Well, Ken, I wanted to ask you where this took place, the interview.
It took place in Encino, California last Thursday, right outside of LA, from a film group called Asylum Entertainment, which had done a scripted series on the Kennedys that won 4 Emmys about 4 or 5 years ago, and now they're doing a documentary series on the Kennedys, and they asked me to come because Paul said no.
Okay. Well, Ken, what did they ask you?
What happened is, I had written an article for the newspaper in Connecticut, the Hartford Courant, on whether or not John Kennedy had PTSD. And I used, the basis for that was a study done by the Harvard Grant Study, which studied 268 people from the classes of 1939 to 1944 and followed them from the rest of their lives. And so one of the people that was identified as almost having PTSD was murdered. In another article, somebody said that was John Kennedy, and then I tried to find out about it, but initially could not. And so they had seen that article because it was on the internet, and they called me and then flew me out there and interviewed me last Thursday.
And I guess another thing I wanted to ask you about was your own transference. Did you think about your transference to the subject matter or other people's, a kind of audience's transference to the cultural figure?
Well, I've been interested in trauma for a long time, partially because like a number of people, I had suffered trauma from being in war. And so it was in researching trauma that I found out about this stuff with Kennedy. And one of the things that was valuable to me that I mentioned in my Hartford Courant piece, was whether or not he did have trauma, he did recover, and he never forgot what happened to him in war, and he used some of that when he was president. But so that, what I ended the article with was that even if you're suffering trauma, that doesn't mean you can't have a flourishing and full life. So I think for people who are when you're in the midst of the trauma, you don't necessarily think there's an end to it. And so for Kennedy and others, there have been an end to it, and for others, it has lingered for many years. There's a guy in Vietnam, and he had flashbacks for 30 years and nightmares for 20 years.
How, in your opinion, how did he use it? How did he use the experience of trauma in his leadership?
What I would say is that he never forgot about what war is like and what it can do to people and how bad he thought war was. So he was isolated for a number of days when his ship was collided with a Japanese destroyer, and he got rescued after he'd written something on a coconut shell and then gave it to somebody else, who then gave it to the people who could rescue him, and they came. He kept that coconut shell in the Oval Office all the time. That was a reminder to him. And he would talk at various times about that life is unfair because some people die in war and some people don't. And also in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he said, we're here, but the people who pay the price for this are those who are fighting. And then, of course, it led him to the American University address, which set the stage for the nuclear test ban treaty. So I think that, he's a complicated character, and most of the time he's a practical politician. There were elements of this primal experience for him that remained with him and helped him see others as human and to work towards peace.
Thank you. So that's all of us.
And thank you, Mark. Now we're going to end the formal part of the presentations with some poems that Peter has written.
And I'm going to put them up on the screen. It's a little bit easier to follow them than just being read. I have noticed.
Do you want the lights down?
We'll see what happens. As you heard, we have empiricists, or are they imperialists? Psychohistorical. Then, as psychohistorians, we tried to get at motivations, and I guess poetry is part of the big tent of psychohistory, and it's a new one. That walk is in Duck, North Carolina. It's a beautiful little area where we were on vacation not too long ago. So let's get to it. This one actually is a poem about the end of the Second World War in April of 1945. It would not have happened if it hadn't been for Dr. Beisel, because David wrote about the suicides at the end of the war, and I had kind of ignored that, how you put things aside. Let's not talk about that. But my stepmother, Mickey, a beautiful, intelligent woman, truly beautiful, she told this story, and you can see the dates. Months ago I started to work on that, and Howard Stein, in whose honor all of these poems are, was very instrumental in making it a little bit better. They dangled from the rafters, a lieutenant and a captain. Belts held them off the floor, four eyes staring over. Oh my God, oh my God. An overturned cot, a polished boot on the ground, a wet spot spread on a pair of pants, a tongue dangling from a mouth. How many more, she asked. No others today, he said. 3 yesterday. There'll be more tomorrow. We came for food, she fumbled for her words. We have no food today. The enemy blew up the truck on the way. Oh no, not again. Young warriors, soldiers. Why tell us? Why? What did you hear? What did you see? What did you do? Was it despair? Was it dissolution? Or both? That brought you to this end. You hang there so glibly, telling us your tale. Did you say more hangings tomorrow? Don't know, he said, don't know. Maybe we'll see some food tomorrow? Don't know, he said, maybe, maybe not. It's not over yet. The two men were actually hanging on the rafters in Nuremberg. The other one is a lot more personal. And it came in the last couple of months. And I'll give you the background because the background is important. The person about whom I'm speaking bears my name. I knew about him, but the internet made it possible for me to finally find out who he really was. So this one too is in honor of Howard, my dear friend Howard. Attila. I rediscovered you not so long ago on the internet, no less. Surely not by accident. This other man with my name, Hungarian and Jew, journalist and fence. Did you know my father? Did he know you? Did you know Wilda, the actor and writer, our namesake in Prague? A Jew, unlike my father, who knew himself as German, from part of Austria-Hungary. The empire was the home for all of you, for me too, by the way. Self-inflicted war destroyed its collection of nations and ethnicities. The Allies freed you from your imperial home. They said you should fend for yourselves. Instead, you went after each other, having discovered your separate identities. What were they thinking when they gave you the name Attila? Scourge of Europe so long ago. Did they anticipate your fame at the Olympics in 1928 and 1932? Fencing was your métier. You harvested medals, we call it, became a national hero, celebrated in press and radio. But the Nazis overran your country, and unlike your namesake in Prague, and like your namesake in Prague, they tortured you to death in a concentration camp. Attila, how dare you disturb my peace with your heritage? The heritage that questions my own. German and American, son of a German from Slovenia. Did my father know you? Did my father know of you? Did my father stay quiet to avoid guilt by association and death by camp? That was tough. This one I wrote a few days ago. Howard and I were emailing about something or other, and afterwards I wrote this one because it's happening less frequently than it used to, but it's happening all the time. They keep coming back, the outrageous memories of the past. They torture my dreams, turn miserable my days. Irresistible they remain with me, the men and women in uniform, striped, tattered, and stained, the children aged and infirm as well, on their way to chambers of death. Trains brought them to the camps in Europe, trucks rolled them to forests in Siberia. Once more they stand naked and waiting for a shower, which sprays gas instead of water. In a field far to the east, others stand naked and ashamed, waiting for a bullet. And they come again to me, men, women, and children, citizens of Germany, Austria, Poland, and Russia, doctors, painters, musicians, and their wives, teachers, preachers, professors, rabbis, and their wives, composers, plumbers, tailors, lawyers, and their wives. With certainty they knew the Gestapo would spare them. They had worked hard for the common good. Trustingly, they thought the NKVD would not knock on their door. They had worked incessantly for the party in the country. Why let into dreams and awareness long ago tales of woe? Why rerun horrors of generations ago? Don't we have our own? Below their masks, killers smirk at lessons from the past. Do not kill, torture, and abuse. They enjoy their endless spree of bloodshed, destruction, and depravity. It is a double-edged sword of the past. Religion perverted, traditions distorted, laws corrupted, and humanity abandoned. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, panelists. Now the floor is open to you to talk, ask questions, or talk about psychohistory as past and present.
There's a group I discovered called Historians Against War, and I went to one of their conferences when it was near DC. I'm involved in Psychologists for Social Responsibility, so it's kind of like, you know, different professional organizations have their group like that, so I wonder if you ever tried connecting with them. That might be a home.
Well, are you asking?
Anyway, yeah.
There's a peace group in history. It's been around for years. We've given papers, several of us, at the ISPP. They welcome psychohistory. They have a category called psychohistory, but not in professional history. There's a group that meets regularly, annually, called the Scholarly Conference on Holocaust and the Churches. And when you go to that conference, there are people from all different disciplines. Probably half those papers are focused on some psychological dimension, as David was saying. So there's work out there, but the dogma of the American Historical Association, 15,000 professional historians, comes down on the work we do with a vengeance. Historians know from graduate school on not to do the history of childhood, not to use psychoanalysis, because they're never going to get ahead. They're not going to get appointed, or they're not going to get promoted. It's a tragedy. It's almost as if the American Historical Association is a delegate of resistance, of collective resistance. So yes, there's work going on, but my focus was on this group of sons of bitches who have been tormenting me personally in my own mind for 45 years. You know? They just won't listen.
Well, I have a question. Can I have follow up with a question about that? I know my colleagues have been very involved with ethical issues with the American Psychological Association around the issue of torture, and there's political, economic issues around the APA, say, compared to the American Medical Association, or getting funding to do work. I mean, there's some background to that. So I'm just wondering, like, what's up with the American Historical Association? Is there any kind of economic or political issue that makes them?
There are groups that are anti-nuke, there are groups that are feminist.
No, but I mean, as the American Historical Association, they have some conservative, some backing, or some political, economic reasons why.
I think most historians tend to be on the liberal side or the moderate side. There are a few conservatives, but by and large, like most academia, it's on the left side. On the left. So,
What's their resistance to understanding human motivation?
that's
People raise your hand first. Okay.
What is their resistance to understanding?
As I said in my paper, I think that the historical profession attracts people who are anti-psychological. I know when I struggled as a historian, trained as a historian, to begin to think, could I do psychohistory? It took me about 3 years in my own therapy. Of course, I was talking about doing therapy rather than doing psychohistory, but the only person who knew that was my therapist. And so it took me a long time to begin to think maybe I could do this work. And then I wrote a long essay that Lloyd DeMoss published in the Journal of Psychohistory in 1978. It was called From History to Psychohistory, A Personal Journey. And if I revisit that, I look at my own struggles. So it's extremely difficult